So within a span of about a week, I found two baby squirrels in my backyard. And the first one was very squirrel-like, was obviously terrified. So we ended up taking her to King of Prussia, where they have the closest wildlife refuge, and that's where she landed. And then about a week later, this little girl showed up, and she was much more docile, much more almost dog like and friendly. So instead of making the trip to King of Prussia, she ended up staying, and this is her first day kind of wandering around my shop. And then within a couple weeks, they're old enough to be released back into the wild. So this is going to be a video showing how to make a house suited for squirrels, um, put it in a tree, and then release them back into the wild once they kind of have the skills to fend for themselves. To start this squirrel house project, I consulted someone who knows a lot more about squirrels than I do, which is the internet. So I actually got this information from a wildlife management site located in Virginia, and that is just because they had detailed plans and reasoning for why you're doing the things you're doing to the house. So the style of the house is fairly tall and skinny, and I kind of cross-referenced some of this information with other websites, and they also seem to stick to that style as well, and that is because of the squirrel and their nesting habits. So I'm not going to steer too far away from the nesting box style of the tall and skinny. Before you start building this, you should think about which side, where you're putting it in a tree, because the opening, which is a 3-inch opening, they recommend should face either south or east to avoid winter winds, and that could affect the way you build it depending on what side your opening's going on. So the rough dimensions for this are about 19.5 by 7. They're all about that size. The front is a little bit wider. So I want to make as much of this as possible out of cedar because I'm not painting it, and from the time I have spent with the squirrel I currently have, they like to chew and gnaw on everything. So pressure treated is probably not a great choice, nor is anything that you would rely on painting. So cedar's fairly durable for outside, and the thickness of it should last longer than potentially even the squirrel. So I have these cedar cutoffs from a project I did years and years and years ago, making some porch railings, and I've kept them. This isn't even all of them. I've used them for various things over the year. They're rough on the outside because of the bit I used. I used a template on a router to cut them. I'm going to keep that roughness. I kind of like it. It will probably look nice in a tree. And what I'm going to do is basically just glue all these together into one slab because it's about 19.5 inches tall. And it's wide enough to make my two sides so that once it's in one piece, I could rip it down the middle and I'll have this kind of nice rounded detailing I could use for the front of the house. So that's kind of where I'm starting with this. There's really no set design, more so than the dimensions they recommend. I'm just going to be kind of finding scrap around my shop and kind of going. It's the next day, and I took this piece out of the clamps. It glued up quite nicely. You can see it's now one solid sheet. And originally I was going to keep this outer edge rough, but because of all the glue drips, it will just look too sloppy. So I'm going to take my angle grinder and rough out. I want to keep this nice curve to the corner, clean this up, and then sand it down. And before I finished for the day yesterday, I also took 2 scraps of cedar I had and glued them together in the middle. Super simple, just some glue and some clamps. two pieces, and this is going to be the back and the front. I made them oversized so I could rip them down and do that. So once I clean this up, I could start making the structure of this box. So these are the rough dimensions of my board. I cleaned up the sides pretty good. In the diagram, they're calling the side with the hole in it the front, which would make the other side the back. So if I use those words interchangeably, it's just because I'm used to calling the thing you see first the front, but they are actually technically calling the side the front. So I'm well aware of the fact that most people probably do not have random strips of cedar or even planks of cedar that you can laminate together, that you can glue together laying around your shop. So the rough dimensions I'm using for my sides are 20.5 by 20. This is going to be my front, which is 21 by 11, and this is going to be the back mounting board, which is 25 by 11. So any wood that's suitable for exterior applications you could use for this project. You don't have to use these. I'm just steering clear of pressure treated lumber because it has chemicals in it, and plywood would not be good because the water gets in those plies and it splits, but even regular pine will last multiple years outside. So I trimmed up this edge and then split these in half, and they ended up being 10 by about 20. So now I'm going to cut that angle on the front for the roof, and I came up 19.5 in the back and 18.5 in the 19.5 in the back, 18 in the front, and then made a diagonal, and I'll cut that diagonal. So I have my two sides, I cut that angle, and then here's my front, and I'm going to be mounting it just like this. The edge of my sides are going to be a little proud of the front of the box, and what I'm going to do is I kept this the width it is, which is about 11 inches, and I didn't cut it down to length because you have to cut an angle in the front so the roof sits flat. But before I do that, I'm going to be cutting a dado into either side of these and then cutting tongues onto either side of this board so that all of this fits together nicely. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut my dados in my two sides, and that will determine the size of my tongue. This is the groove I have. It's 3/8 I cut. It's 3/8 I cut with the 1/4 inch stack, and then moved it over the width of one blade and cut again to get that 3/8. So now I have to cut tongues on the front of my piece, 2 tongues, in order to fit in this groove. So I have my dado stack still in there, and to get 3/8 I'm going to cut about 15/16 off either side, and I'm going to cut all 4 corners and then keep sliding it over until I get the depth that will fit in that groove. So that's the tongue I ended up with on either side of this piece, and you can see that it fits in that groove snugly and nicely. So with this in place, I can now turn it to the side and mark that angle on the side and cut this down to height and at the proper angle all at once. So I have this squirrel house mocked up, and the back of it, the opening ended up being a little bit wider than originally anticipated. So the back I have for this isn't going to be quite wide enough to cover it the way I want. So what I'm going to have to do is, this actually turned out to be exactly 24 inches long. I'm going to cut it in half, get two 12-inch pieces, and be able to stack those to cover the back. So I'm going to rip this down. I marked my 12 inches. I'm going to rip this down on my radial arm saw, and then I'm going to be cutting two dados in the back of this for the back to fit into the back side of the squirrel house to fit into those dados. And this is 1.25 inches wide, so I'm going to be cutting two dados 1.25 inches wide on the back of these boards. When I had these boards on the back, I rough marked where that back will meet the backer board, and it comes in about 3/8 of an inch, and it goes to about 1.75 inches. So I'm set my dado stack to cut this first mark and go about halfway through my piece, so I could send all these through on all sides and slide it over till I cut that groove. The angle I ended up cutting this front roof part at was 8 degrees. So with that cut and the back made, I'm going to glue this all together. And I'm going to be relying pretty much solely on clamps for the time being to glue this together. And that is because I don't really care what anyone says. Anything you put outside that is wood is eventually going to rot and fall apart. I've seen many birdhouses make it to the graveyard, and that's one of the reasons I'm spending so much time on these joints, is because if you're relying on screws and butt joints, the water gets into those joints so much easier. It rots the edge grain, the screws rust and rot the holes, and then things start to fall apart. When you have these deep groove dados with this glue, which is actually water resistant, it's not waterproof glue, it's water resistant glue that helps over time with things with water really messing with your projects. And considering that this is going to be in a tree where sunlight is not really going to be able to dry things out, you're going to have a lot of dampness involved with this project. So the extra time I spent on all these joints and grooves coincides with the placement of the piece. The squirrel box out of the clamps, and that's pretty much what it looks like right now. And I have two scraps of cedar that I'm going to glue together tonight, so tomorrow I could form them into the lid.